Live, so if you want to go back and watch it later, you can. And then we're going to be posting all of our materials and hands out to Facebook at the end of the event.
So I mean, that can't cost, right?
Correct.
President. I don't cuss.
Looks like you guys are finishing up, so I'll come and collect those in a minute. So we'll go ahead and get started then. So tonight our presenter is Dr. Dave Lusk. He's presenting about stress management. He's been around Truman for a while working at the Career Center. He got his PhD in counseling psychology with a specialty in career decision making for 18 to 25-year-olds from the University of Kansas. And he did his PhD internship at Kansas State University. He worked as a counselor and he worked in the biofeedback clinic. So stress management and career stress management is kind of his focus. So he's going to take over now.
Okay. Woo! All right, I've been anxious all day. You know, it's funny that I'm anxious about a stress management presentation, or I'm stressed about a stress management presentation. So I don't know about you, but I have anticipatory anxiety, and so I'll get anxious about what's going to happen. And then about 30 minutes before the presentation, I'm pretty calm, and then I'm ready to go. So the idea in kind of having me jump around in front of you is that stress isn't necessarily in and of itself bad. And I think that what we need to learn to do is to be able to kind of figure out what are our cues to get stressed, or maybe we have friends that can help us and maybe identify that we're getting stressed before it happens, okay? So let me kind of talk about what I mean by that. And I think there's been some research that it's not necessarily the inverted U hypothesis just yet. I think there's a little bit, and the research is a little different than this, but I think it gets the point across what I'm going to show you. And so I'm going to put stress up here, and over here I want to put performance. And so a lot of times it's called the inverted U hypothesis. Now I do think it's actually an inverted W now or something like that. But the general sense is that if we have very little stress, oftentimes we don't care, so we might not perform very well. Okay. Now we can have. You know what? I totally screwed this up. I bet. Yep, I bet. Yeah, there you go. There you go, Facebook Live. Yeah, I'm anxious because of you. All right. Let's do it this way. Okay. Woo. All right. And so it's still that inverted U, and the idea is if you don't have a lot of stress, the performance isn't there. And so what we're really trying to figure out a lot of times is what is this area here? To where we want to get to figure out when we start to lose, the stress gets so much it starts to affect our performance negatively. And so oftentimes we call this area eustress, and U means good. And then after here we're calling distress. So I'm assuming that when I mislabeled these, I was probably a little bit over here, and so I'm trying to focus my breathing a little deeper. I'm trying to realize in my head, I'm kind of saying, hey, we're all friends here. 7 of these people I know really well. And I look forward to getting to know the rest of you. And so can I bring myself back into the room, so to speak? And so hopefully I'm doing some things right now that's pushing me back to be at my top performance. But what I wanted you to see about that is stress in and of itself is not bad. But it's when it gets to that point where it's debilitating or when we're not having enough of it. Okay? And so how do you know when you're starting to get into that distress mode? Where the amount of stress you have is starting to negatively impact your performance. Okay, so Jesse, what are some triggers for you? You and I worked with each other quite a bit. I could see that potentially maybe you might get some facial flushing because you're light complected, okay? So you're having, what are other things that happen when you're kind of realizing like, ooh, I'm kind of getting to that point where the stress may be debilitating?
I think it happens at a point where I'm a lot more aware of and concerned my stress than I am actually of like the project at hand.
Good, excellent. And for instance, today, Jenny was asking me if I needed anything. I'm like, fine, you know, kind of thing. Because I still needed to work on the presentation, though I've been working on this for 25 years. So I think it's interesting. For me, I tend to become a little more irritable. And that can be a little bit of a sign for me. I also, a lot of times, and I have a quote at the top, it's the second one. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, and the expert's mind, there are few. And so this is kind of talking about a cognitive idea of stress. a lot of times when I start to get stressed, I start thinking when I'm working with a client, oh, this client reminds me of this person. So I get into that expert role, and sometimes getting into that mode for me means I'm not open to newness. And so in that quote, I think the power of that quote is that in the beginner's mind, there needs to be a lot of possibilities. Oftentimes when we get stressed, cognitively, we start to get more and more narrow in terms of how we may potentially interpret an event, okay? So I'm going to talk to you tonight about cognitive ramifications, behavioral ones, okay? So what would be an example of a behavioral indicator of stress? Okay, psychomotor agitation could be one. Maybe some physiologically sweating, okay? I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I get anxious, and when stress is kind of a temporary state, but anxiety is more of a chronic state, with that stress, I start to hold my breath, and I don't even know I'm doing it. I start to get a headache. Do any of you oftentimes, do you show your stress in a physiological way in terms of muscle tension? Okay? And so for me, I get it in the middle of my back. Now Logan is cool as a cucumber, so I'm not sure he's ever been stressed, but let's assume you might be stressed, and it's manifesting itself physiologically. How would you be able to notice that in terms of if you're trying to scan your body and figure out, something's not right?
I mean, like, especially if I'm alone and like trying to focus on a single thing, I will sweat, and I will be kind of like restless, and I'll be moving a lot of my body parts, but mostly it is internal with like scattered thoughts.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Do any of you worry about worrying about things? That's called cognitive rumination. It's kind of like a cow ruminates on its cud, so to speak, kind of chews it over and over and over. Now, if you are chronically stressed, and I kind of tend to be kind of a stressed guy, and so as I work with relaxation stuff, eventually, if I can do it right, I won't worrying about things. But then that stresses me out even more because I have nothing to worry about. Have you ever had that experience where you're like, something's wrong here? I'm not worried. That's weird. Okay. And so the idea with stress is that it's not a bad thing, but we have to have knowledge. And if we can have knowledge, that can give us power, which can allow us to have control with our stress. Okay. So let's think about a negative automatic thought that I get when I get stressed. And automatic thoughts are kind of these thoughts we say to ourselves over and over that they almost become habitual. And we don't even know that we're saying them. And so when I get stressed, one of my main things is, am I competent? And if I start thinking like that, I start to see negatives everywhere around, okay? And so what would be a better self-statement that I could say that can reverse, am I competent? I've done this before. I've presented on stress for the last 3 decades at multiple schools, okay? Or what is a positive cognition that you say to yourself when you try to talk your way out of this distress to get you back into eustress? What is a positive message you can intentionally say to yourself out loud, or you could say it internally? You have any kind of positive statements? Yeah.
A big thing for me is I like to internalize all of my obligations and clump them up. So whenever I have a task, I'm like, one step at a time, this is the only problem that I have ahead of me. We'll worry about the other stuff.
Okay, and that's a very good technique because what he's doing there is he's containing. He's trying to control. He's focusing on that which is in front of you. There's an interesting book by Sheldon Kopp called Back to One. And I was reading the beginning of that book. And there's this technique when you're trying to control breathing that you actually try to clear your mind and you focus on your inhale and your exhale. And you try to focus on counting to 10. Okay. Well, when I first read that, I would get so mad because I'd get to 3 and something else would come into my head. Okay. And so the idea is you're supposed to just focus on those numbers on your breathing. And I was so focused on the accomplishment of getting to 10, I think really what he's talking about, life is about always going back to 1. It's going back to that stable place where you can have these messages to yourself of, I'm going to break this down into pieces. Okay. Let's say for some people, especially when they get stressed, they go to friends. So does anybody over here go to friends when they're stressed? Okay. What's helpful about doing that?
It's just someone to vent to or talk to about what's going on, and they'll sit there and listen.
And for some of us, we need to externally process things. Okay. Whereas Logan might do something that he may turn inward. I turn inward when I get stressed. And that's where there's a period there where it can go bad, But if I focus on that breathing, or if I'm with my dogs, Do you know that actually being around dogs can lower your blood pressure? Okay. Or I gave you tea. One of the things, a tea bag. One of the things that I like about tea is you can't rush the brewing process. And so sometimes when I'm stressed, I try to focus on breathing deeply until my tea is ready. And that might sound silly, but I think all of us are going to come up with little gains or little ways that we can help bring ourselves back to this eustress area. Okay. So we talked a little bit about behaviors, some physiology. We've talked a little bit about behavior in terms of that I get emotions. I get irritable, right? And we talked a little bit about cognitions. Have you ever heard the phrase the fight or flight response? Okay. Yeah. And so the idea is that our body actually can go into a fight or flight response involuntarily. And it used to be that was a good thing. So if I saw this tiger coming at me, either I'm going to fight this tiger or I'm going to run. Okay. Well, we really don't have those as immediate dangers as much as we used to. But we have all of these things that are hitting us every day, these small stressors that start to accumulate. And so I think in a lot of ways in today's society, we probably are already always in that chronic kind of fight or flight response. Now our body has a relaxation response that we can initiate, but that has to be more voluntary, okay? So just like if I'm stressed out, I want to talk to you a little bit about how it plays out in your body. So if we're in the fight or flight response, what do you think happens to your muscle tension? Does it increase or does it go down? What's that? It increases, right? Because I need to be able to fight or run. Okay? So it's going to increase. What about your heart rate? It's going to increase as well. And we need it to increase so it can pump more blood, especially to the vital parts of our body. Oftentimes when we're stressed, our peripheral skin temperature will go down. And sometimes your feet will go down. Okay, so peripheral skin temperature goes down. Your heart rate goes up. It's starting to pump blood to the major parts of your body, those big muscle groups that are going to have to respond. Your breathing oftentimes becomes shallower. And so you're doing more chest breathing. You're not doing diaphragmatic breathing. Okay? And so one way that you can try to relax is you try to picture that you have a ball bladder inside of a bladder, you might have a little ball. And it's or a balloon. That would be a better way of saying that. And so you try to breathe in such a way that you're trying to inhale and you're trying to increase the size of the balloon. Okay, that is a deeper type of breath. And so that is one way, if you know you're in a fight or flight response, if you can focus on breathing, you can try to get your body to come over to this relaxation response. Now, do you think you increase in terms of sweat when you're stressed, or does it go down? So yeah, I was sitting over here and I wrote the 4 things down. I'm like, oh gosh, I can't remember the last one. What is it? And I'm thinking, you know what, I should just breathe right now. I was like, oh yeah, I'm sweating. So it's sweat. So our sweat production increases. And that helps with lubrication so that we can, again, move quickly, do the things that we need to do. So what is one thing that you think you could do if you're experiencing a crick in your neck or muscle tension in your neck? What could you do that could help to decrease that tension? You can stretch. And I was actually walking around the hallway like this, and Dr. Thomas, that's our president, sorry, she's awesome. Dr. Dixon was in the past. She looks at me, she's like, what are you doing, Dave? And I'm like, I'm just kind of stretching out, sort of thing. How about doing a neck massage for yourself, okay? And trying to release that tension. Now, you know what's really cool? Is if you do that, and as you're doing it, you're working on breathing deeply and exhaling. Oftentimes, really focus on the exhale. So let's think about it. You're kind of taking a breath in. So oftentimes, focus on that breath going out of your body. And when you're doing that, that muscle tension should decrease to some extent. Okay? I get a lot of cramps in my calves at night. Does anybody wake up with cramps in their legs? Okay. Well, one thing is we probably need to drink water. We probably need to have more potassium. But also, I just bounce my foot all the time. And these bands that I have, they're really bad at staying tied. So I'll do that and my shoes will be untied. And so sometimes for me, if that seems to be happening more in the day than it normally does, I need to step back and go, what's bothering me? What's really kind of amping my engine, so to speak? Okay, so you could massage. You could go for a run in a way. What happens is if you don't exercise a lot, we always associate muscle tension, increased heart rate, increased breathing with stress. So by exercising, you're putting your body in a kind of stressful state, but you're associating the idea that that can be a release for you. And so as I started doing more exercise, which I have stopped doing, oftentimes it helps my body to realize that if I have muscle tension, I need to go for a run or something. I need to get this energy out. Okay? And it might sound counterintuitive that you're doing that, but you're associating a physical state with an emotional state. And so if you can substitute exercise in place of that anxiety, it gives your body more control in terms of how it interprets its cues. Peripheral skin temperature. That is how I started with biofeedback. Biofeedback, it can be very simple. You can actually take a little thermometer and you can put it between your fingers. And it will tell you what that peripheral skin temperature is. And I'd say right now, my peripheral skin temperature is probably about 82 to 85. Usually if we're getting in that relaxed state, we're getting up in the 90s. Okay. And so what you can do is you can actually practice with some of these mini tranquilizers. This is a natural form of tranquilization. And actually do some deep breathing. Or you can focus on some imagery. In the handouts I gave you stuff about cognitive restructuring. So how can you think, kind of say different kind of automatic messages in your head? How can you use color and imagery to kind of help you to de-stress, okay? Also, tense and release exercises are really important. So I've given you a couple scripts in there that if you want to work on progressive deep muscle relaxation, you know, oftentimes you start with your neck and you kind of crunch it up like this. And you hold it for 5 seconds, and then what you focus on is exhaling and releasing at the same time. So it's like, and they'll work from the head, and they'll go all the way down to your feet, okay? Now, I usually only get to my lower back, where you lay flat, and you're supposed to arch your back, and then you focus on the release. I arch my back, and it won't release, because I'm in that chronic fight or flight response. And I've been in that way for quite some time. Okay. What are some behaviors that you do when you're stressed? Okay. One thing that I might do is I might drink a cereal malt beverage more than I should when I'm stressed. And I think you know, the quality of a high or the quality of drinking, it's going to be affected by your mindset and your setting that you're in. And if one of those two things are off, oftentimes you can have a bad experience. And so for some people, and I'm one of them, on the quiz it says that we might drink a little more than normal. And a lot of times when I do that, I need to step back and go, why am I doing that? Okay. I don't drive recklessly necessarily, but I can yell belligerently at people. And you know, that might be a short-term release, but then I spend the next 2 weeks worrying about how I was mean to somebody. And it's just not worth doing. You know? And oftentimes it's not that person that I'm mad at. It's that I'm frustrated about something else in my life and you happen to be that convenient target. And what's bad about that is I think that a lot of people look at health in terms of a system, not just a person. And if we're passing along this negative energy, my negative energy can start to affect you. And you may not know why, and then you pass it on to that person. And that's fascinating when we look at health, especially from a systemic perspective, in terms of how do we deal with that stress. Okay. So, how do you know you're stressed?
Well, if I'm like overstressed, I feel like I kind of shut down and I immediately.
Okay. So you do less? Okay. Does anybody have TMJ? That's when you get tension in your jaw to the point that sometimes it'll just lock up. Okay. And you know, a really good thing is actually massage that when you have that kind of opportunity. How about bruxism? You know what that is? That's when you grind your teeth. And that's kind of hard to know if you sleep by yourself. But if you are sleeping with someone else, look, what are you doing over there? So does anybody grind teeth? Yeah. And I think that's because we're going to bed and we're carrying some of that stress with us. Okay. So in this packet, it'll talk about things that you can do to start creating a tense and release exercise that you do over time. The best way to find out how to initiate the relaxation response is to practice the techniques that help you move out of the fight or flight to the relaxation response. How many of you eat when you're stressed? Okay, yeah. And then we feel guilty about what we ate, right? Okay. And then we feel awful the next day. You know, we're like, whoa, why do I feel so full? I've gone to the bathroom like 9 times. Oh yeah, that's because I ate 5 bags of Doritos. Okay. How many of you drink more caffeine when you're stressed? Okay, and what's problematic about that? I think it almost puts you over here and it dehydrates you. Have you ever, anyone ever suffered from chronic dehydration? Ooh, that can really mess with you. I mean, you can get to a point where you may have visual hallucinations, and it can be really rough. You can really start questioning, you know, am I okay, type of thing. Okay. So let's see here. We've talked a little bit about cognitions, some behaviors. What are some associated emotions other than anger and irritability that sometimes people get when they're stressed? When my stress turns into chronicness and it's anxiety, I get sad. And oftentimes, anger is a cover for other types of emotions. And so it might be weird to think that sadness can be associated as an emotion with stress or chronic anxiety. Any other emotions? Some people may just laugh uncontrollably and they can't stop. Have you ever done that? So what are some emotions that might come out for you if you've been stressed for a long time?
It's kind of similar, kind of anxious and sad.
Okay. I mishear what people say. You know, sometimes I'll think that they're saying something in a negative way, or I'll read an email or a text. And then have you ever gone back to it later after you're kind of calmed down and you're like, whoa, I really misread that. And I think in a way that's when we're almost becoming that expert, because we're reading it and you know exactly what they meant. And a text message. Yeah, right? Okay. And you know, I'm now into emojis, right? Is that like when you guys were 5? You know, and so it's really fun as I send emojis to Jenny because she's like, I have no idea how to interpret your emojis. But that's what's kind of fun about it. I feel like I discovered something that other people don't know about. Right? Okay. All right. So let's see here. We talked about physiology, fight or flight response. Okay. What's a stress signal for you?
I can't focus.
Can't focus. Okay. Yep.
I get
Okay, you get jittery. Okay. How about you? What's a stress signal for you?
I like seclude myself. I don't want anyone talking or helping.
Okay. And you know what's hard for me is when I do seclude myself, and if people come to help, I get really mean. That's right. And then they walk away worried, you know, about what's wrong with them. And I think as I've gotten older, I've had to just know, I've had to say, you know what, I'm kind of having a really day, and I just need a little bit of time by myself. That was my attempt to cuss without cussing. Right? Okay. All right. When I get really stressed, I can rip off a series of words that are kind of like, whoa, where did that come from? And my dogs can pick up when I'm stressed. And sometimes they're a good tell for me. If I start seeing they're anxious, I'm kind of like, what's wrong with you? And I'm kind of thinking, well, what am I doing in the environment that might be causing that for them? Stress signal for you? Well, in some ways, I might have put you in a stress response right there. Come on in, boy, what are you doing, man? Okay, sorry. They told me that they had to leave, so they didn't want me to feel bad, which is really nice. And in some ways, they're kind of foreshadowing or forecasting, hey, I'm leaving. I don't want you to think that you're doing a bad job, which is really helpful. Okay. Jenny, what's the stress signal for you? She's the woman behind the camera.
Hi. I have a tendency to feel the need to pick up even more responsibilities, so I'm not disappointing people more because that's my biggest fear.
That is very true. And we work together. And as a boss, sometimes I'm kind of like it. You know, I know it's not good. How many people make themselves sick after a while of chronic stress that turns into anxiety? I really manifest my stress after a long period of time in my GI tract. I know that sounds disgusting, but and so a lot of times I And then if you have allergies on top of that, oh, that just really messes your stomach up. But then you don't want to even eat anymore. So you're doing the wrong things that keep you in the state that you want to get out of. How about our parents? I think as kids, we probably start to learn about stress by watching our parents. And we're kind of like, something just happened that just didn't seem right. It's out of proportion. My dad would, he would just be very critical. He'd be kind of the master of the backhand compliment. And if I'm already stressed, I'm like, okay, I'm listening for the negative, kind of thing. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. That's just the way he would manifest that. Now, when I was younger, I thought it was my responsibility to change that mood. Well, don't get into that, because you're trying to control something you can't control, and that's a really bad dynamic to play. What's something that your parents would do when you were growing up that you were kind of like, oh, it must be stress, and you probably didn't even know at that point that's what that was. Yeah.
I think I learned this from my mom. So whenever I'm stressed, I will start doing things that do not need to be done at that moment. I will avoid whatever I'm supposed to be doing. Like yesterday, I started color coding my planner for next semester instead of doing the homework that's due, tomorrow. And that's kind of what my mom used to do is instead of like doing something that we were supposed to be doing, she would start planning like our vacation for the next year, or just kind of avoiding the situation at hand by doing more responsibilities at that moment.
Well, I think a lot of times when we get into this fight or flight response, we can become very prejudicial. I think some of our worst sides can come out. And if we're not careful about that, and we're in that chronic state, people might read from our behavior a type of person that we really aren't. Sort of thing.
It's not all bad because, the stuff has to be done at some point, but I'm like, I don't need to be doing this at this very moment.
No, that's a good time. Okay. Yeah.
So I have a very much flight response, but my dad has a fight response. So anytime he would be stressed, he would get angry extremely easily, and so he would physically blow up, to conquer whatever's stressing him,
That's right.
even if it's just the person in front of him. And so I feel myself get ready to fight, even though I know I'm actually getting ready to fight.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then my mom would just handle it emotionally, so I would get ready to fight, and then I would just cry, and people get freaked out.
What's interesting is I do think it's these learned behaviors, and so sometimes we may associate stress with I need to go somewhere else because when we were younger, we knew that made the most sense. And having to deprogram ourselves from not associating that with other people's stress. How many of you feel when people are stressed, you feel it's your responsibility to take care of it for them? Yeah. And what do? I get more agitated, I try to draw attention to myself. Sometimes I'll try to become the joker of the group. And then I'll be like, why am I doing these things? But I think for me, as an only child, the point is that I was supposed to keep everything going. I was that connector. What's a good support outlet that you use when you get stressed that can help get you back to the relaxation response? Okay, for me, a dog, going for a walk. I like to cook, not often, but when I do, I get into it, meal prepping, like the next 7 weeks. Okay. Now that's probably a little intense, but, yeah?
I clean. A lot.
No, I totally do. My friends make so much fun of me. I'll be like, I'm gonna clean the house today, and they're like, okay, that'll take 2 hours. I'll spend 8 hours cleaning the house. And the cool thing about it is, I'm getting I'm moving a lot, so at least I'm kind of burning some of that off and getting my heart rate elevated. And I'm convinced, I don't think I'm necessarily skinny, but I think part of me not handling my stress well is that I move a lot. It's hard for me to fall asleep at night. Oftentimes I'll have twitches as I'm trying to relax. I remember doing some relaxation training in which we were doing deep breathing, and in the script it talks about closing your eyes. And I did some deep breathing, and I got freaked out. And I asked the guy who was training us, what is that about? And he's like, Dave, I don't think your body has ever gotten to that stage before. And it didn't know how to respond to it. So I had a stress reaction to being in the relaxation response. So yeah.
Did you ever studies about like either the chemical makeup or like the physical composition of the hippocampus? And like when you're in a chronic state of stress, your body just adapts to it, and so it just kind of assumes that state all the time. And so you aren't able to calm down because you're just always in a constant state of stress.
So that's where biofeedback could be really important, but it's going to take a long time to help your body reinterpret. That's an excellent, what you're saying is excellent, is that we've actually associated some of these things with this. And that's where it gets really complicated for us. Now, did you have a question there? I'm sorry. No. You're right. I mean, that you're looking at that brain chemistry, and it will talk about that in there and how we start to associate those types of things. Okay. So that's now, I don't want to say that you shouldn't go out and drink with friends. I think it's a function of what is the mindset and the setting you're in. If you feel comfortable in that setting, and your mind says, I want to have a good time, no problem. But sometimes people will talk about drinking to kind of help, it's kind of, I can't believe I'm going to say this on the internet, but it's like a social lubricant. I don't know what else to say. It makes kind of that social stuff a little bit easier, right? Well, I think that's okay, but if our stress continues to go up and we're drinking more and more, and we're associating that I need to drink more to feel less stressed, well, oftentimes I think it can put us in a bad place because we're misreading our symbols, our signals. How many of you just occasionally just do something weird and you're just creative and you break your routine? When I realize sometimes it's too late, when I'm in a chronic stress situation that turns into anxiety, I'll become very regimented about how I'll do things. And if I end up not doing those things, I end up getting stressed about it. And so at that point, I need to break my patterns. Go do something that's unexpected. Go just do some artwork. Logan, what do you do sometimes to be creative and break routine?
I will sometimes write songs or just spoken word poetry. That's like a genre if I were to externalize.
You know, for me, if I'm stressed, I go over and I say, Logan, will you do that kickflip with the skateboard? You know, that's just amazing to watch that because I don't have the guts to do that. And I'm not sure he really appreciates it because he might hurt his ankle or something like that. But have you ever used skating as a way to de-stress?
100%.
And what about it helps you to de-stress?
It's honestly, I usually do it with Austin Kerwood, one of my best buds. So we also get that friend aspect in there. But it's honestly just being outside and having an outlet for exercise. Because if it weren't for skateboarding, I wouldn't go on runs. Like, I can hardly find time to go to the gym. But just kind of having that hobby that you love, being an outlet.
Outdoors for me are often de-stressors for me because I really focus on the listening. Try to find out if I can listen to like 10 different things that I didn't normally pick up. And to be able to do that, you really need to start breathing deeply. And even if you don't realize it, you're listening, your breathing will slow down and it will become more diaphragmatic. Okay. This is a hard one for me because I tend to avoid things when I'm stressed. And so instead of solving problems, I react to them. How many of you, well, I'll tell you this. I mean, I've got tons of personal statements right now that I'm supposed to be looking at. And I have a lot of performance anxiety about wanting to give the client the best product. And so sometimes when I'm stressed, I avoid that, so today before the program, I contacted everybody I could and set those appointments up. And I was like, ooh, I can go do this program now. Because that's just something that's been in the back of my head that I haven't gotten this done. Or that paper that you need to go work on, but you decided to paint the outside of your house with a toothbrush, instead of writing the paper. I've seriously thought about that before. I'm like, like my term paper, my fall semester, my senior year of college, I tend to need to be pressure prompted to make a decision. Some people would call that procrastination. For me, I believe if I wait long enough, the right resource will come along, or I'll find it that'll make the paper come together. And so I decided I was going to write my term paper, which was due in December, over Thanksgiving. You want to talk about trying to come up with excuses not to do that paper. Here's the funny part is I got the paper done, but then I went to the library a couple more times, found more articles, and I rewrote it the night before the paper was due. So sometimes I think we just need to learn our style and be comfortable with that. So how did that play out when I went to grad school? Well, a lot of times, 30 out of 31 days in a month, I'm really fun, spontaneous, and like Winnie the Pooh walking through the forest looking for honey. But if it's that day before the paper's due, people will come up and they're like, hey, what's up? I'm like, fine! You know, kind of thing. And so what I learned in graduate school, I would actually get my syllabus out and I would look at when exams were, and I would really intentionally try to make sure I don't work on those days. Because if I did, I would make myself sick through worry and I wouldn't go to work. I'd be seen as a flake, but I'd get the assignment done. And so I'm just not, I really would encourage you, figure out what your style is in terms of how you approach that and shape your life to the style. If you don't do that, you will be chronically putting yourself in a stressful situation. How many of you have been really frustrated with somebody and you practice every way in your head to tell them off? Yeah. And sometimes when that happens, I know that it's not my time to go say anything just yet. But sometimes I wish before I got into that, I would really just just face the problem. Because have you ever had that experience where you're so mad at somebody, and then finally you talk to them and you realize it was just a simple misunderstanding? I think that's that stress that gets going. It almost gets me to want to, I almost get like, come on, let's go. And sort of, and the person, if I did that, the person would be like, what are you doing? I didn't say that. Well, I thought you did. Kind of thing. All right. What is something you've done for yourself that treated yourself for doing good work? Yeah?
I watch movies whenever I do something good.
Okay. I'd love to measure your heart rate at that point, your peripheral skin temperature, breathing. I would bet you that you're getting into that relaxation response. So sometimes when you're stressed, it may make sense to go watch a movie. Sometimes when I pet my dogs, I'll realize, I'm really worked up about something that I really shouldn't be. But it almost takes me petting the dog to relax, to get to the point where I can have enough cognitive flexibility, where I see more possibilities and can interpret things from a different perspective. Let's talk a little bit about cognitive restructuring. You don't need to find this, I bet, in your booklet here, but. So the idea of cognitive restructuring. So let's say I'm getting ready to do a presentation and I'm anxious, and so my automatic thought comes up that I'm not competent. I didn't number these pages, so it's like the second from the last or something like that. It looks like this. These are some things that you can say to yourself. Is this really true? Am I jumping to conclusions? What is the evidence that I have that I'm incompetent? Am I exaggerating or overemphasizing a negative aspect of the situation? Or what they would call, are you catastrophizing? How do I know that I'll do a bad job in a presentation? And what I like to do with clients, I was like, do you have evidence where you have done bad? So, oh, no. So you've done it well, right? Oh, yeah. Okay. But you're worried you're going to do it bad. Oh, yeah. Okay. So what if it really happened? What if I just did an awful presentation? Just kidding. No, what if I did? I would have wasted your time. But my hope is by some of the responses, and that's why I asked a lot of questions, is I think when we're stressed a lot of times, we think that there's something wrong with us and that we don't want to share with other people. Well, I think when you share how stress affects you, it brings us all together. It makes it more normalized. And I think we take a deeper breath and realize, you know what, that's just part of life. Is it to my advantage to maintain the idea that I'm not competent? I've made it to 48 years. I have a roof over my head. I have 3 wonderful dogs. I'm able to provide for them. I'm able to, haven't done it as much lately, but be around the AKLs and cook out. I have the means to be able to do that. And I'm very fortunate. I have a great coworker that will call me on my crap when it happens, right? Is there another way to look at the situation? And there always has to be another way to look at the situation. So how do we rely on each other? So you all, I bet you that you will know when he's stressed before he knows it. And I bet you'll pick that up here. Now what's tough is you may not feel like I should say something. If we could have it in such a way that as brothers we could say, hey man, you're really kind of tweaking out, dude, or something like that. And I'm not saying that's how you do things. I'm just saying, if we can have that kind of communication, that can be really powerful. Now, normally what will happen, though, is if someone will call me on that, I'll be like, no, I'm not. And then what I need you to do is just look at me like, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right. Okay, thanks a lot. Because I think sometimes to call someone out can be really helpful to them. You're being a witness to their anxiety. But we have to invite that. We have to welcome them. And I think what's hard is when we've seen someone be chronically stressed for so long, we don't know how to say something to them. And they start to withdraw. And that's where we've got to help to pull people out when they're starting to get into that fight or flight response. And so be brave. Say the things you feel like your friends need to hear, even if they don't want to hear those things. Because I would much rather you get frustrated at me for saying I think you're stressed or you're misreading a situation so that we could work it out, and then you would be better. And if I need to take a little bit of your negative energy there, it's okay, because we can share it together and then we'll throw it away together. But that is so hard for us to do. Okay. So Jesse, what is one thing, now Joel, you're not here, but hopefully you're watching. Good job in getting all the people here. What is one thing that you can tell when Joel's getting stressed?
Going down the list, he has like a certain laugh that he does whenever things are like up here. He looks down and goes, and that's when you know like it's about to boil over. He really wrinkles his forehead. Joel, I'm sorry if I'm just trashing you right now.
Yeah, Joe, it's really unfortunate. We really shouldn't be calling you out on this, but no. But I mean, I think we all do that. Jenny, how do you know I'm stressed when I'm getting stressed?
You generally get shorter responses and you withdraw more.
Yeah, and I'm becoming an ASS, and that's kind of how my dad would do things. And so I think it's really interesting how we might. I mean, is that a genetic thing, or is that an environmental where we've learned those types of things? And to see how that can cycle through generations of a family. Now, keep in mind, those people that are mad and stuff like that are like my dad. I don't think that that's necessarily his fault. I mean, I think that that's where it would make more sense to kind of go, what are you mad about? You know, kind of thing. What can I do to help with that? Are you frustrated? Is there something I'm not doing right? To be able to proactively talk to each other. You can know that you have stressful automatic thoughts if you deal in absolutes. Should, ought, always, must. Challenge yourself. Must you do that? Is that the only option that you have? Okay. What do you think is the average amount of sleep you should get?
8 hours.
Okay.
Like
7. There's different research on that. Some people say as we get older that some people don't by 6 to 7.5 hours. And so that's a little different than what some people say. And maybe that research has changed. I don't know, but I tend to sleep a lot when I'm stressed, and especially when the sun goes down more. And I think it kind of gets me into that seasonal affective kind of thing. And I mean, do you ever in the morning where you don't want to get out of bed and it's like, leave the world, leave me alone, sort of thing? And so there'll be stuff in here that'll talk about get up at the same time every morning. When's the last time you've done that in a week?
I don't think I have.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And I think right now you can do that. But you know what I'm finding as I get older, I can't sleep as much, though I try. And so on the weekends, I end up getting up at the same time. And you know what's fun about that? Is I don't have to be to work. So I'm starting to realize that I have more time that I can do what I want. That's weird, huh? Okay, it also probably doesn't help that my dog at 5 o'clock goes, let's eat, you know, kind of thing. But that also kind of helps me to get up at that time frame. All right. let's see, is there anything else I kind of wanted to talk about? Well, what questions do you have about what we talked about today? I think a lot of you are experts at stress, right?
Yeah. I know how you talked about how stress levels can kind of intertangle themselves with drinking, but that is a depressant, which helps the cause physiologically. What if we were dependent on nicotine? How does that kind of play?
What do you think? That's a good question.
I don't know, short term.
I think it's also interesting to look at if you have like attention deficit kind of issues. That isn't Ritalin for most people a stimulant, but that actually can slow down someone that has that kind of brain chemistry, so to speak. And so you're saying in some ways that alcohol might be able to reduce some of these things, that it could help us to relax. Yeah.
But like, if you're dependent on nicotine, like, does that only exponentiate the fight or flight in the long run? Or that's not really anything for anyone to answer?
That's a good research question. I think when I'm doing my drinking of cereal malt beverages, I do think it can kind of relax me, but after a certain point, I start remembering who I'm mad at. And then I start rehearsing these discussions about how I'm going to destroy them, in some kind of intellectual conversation. So I think for me, there's a tipping point there. Now with nicotine, what are people's thoughts about that? So that is a stimulant. So it is going to increase heart rate. It's going to increase, I don't know, does it increase sweat production? I'm not sure about that. Lindsay, what do you think about that? Nicotine as a way, for some people they associate it with relaxation. I guess for me it'd be interesting, what if we took it away? What would happen?
It also has a tendency to increase the amount of food in your hunger and appetite a lot, so people will start to smoke more and then eat less too when
All
they're
right,
stressed.
so then you're kind of starving your body, putting into that situation, which could be a chronic stress sort of situation. I don't know if I'm really addressing your question.
It's a loaded topic.
I'd like to know what you think about it. What do you think?
Well, if you stay off of it, I feel like it'll cause more stress because you become irritable, you become focused on the things that are problematic in your life. But if you keep going back to it, it exponentiates the fight or flight. But you get that kind of 30-minute relief from all of those bad stressful symptoms. But then after the 30 minutes, you're just like, here we are again.
So yeah, so we're getting some weird associations going on in our head. It may be probably confusing our body in terms of that, so we'll smoke for that 30 minutes, but then we've got that other part that we don't have. And I'm not going to say that you shouldn't smoke or you shouldn't drink. I'm a libertarian. I think that you should do what you want to do, just as long as you're not hurting other people. Now, some people may say you shouldn't do things that hurt yourself. Okay, and maybe I shouldn't say that in a higher education environment. But people are going to do what they're going to do. And I think we need to be resources to their needs and be available to talk to them and listen to them. But if we're good enough friends, say what we think to them. Don't be afraid of the blow up. Know that sometimes if we confront people, at first it could get nasty, but then you wade through that. Take some deep breaths with that. Because a lot of times you get on the other side of that issue and you're like, wow, this wasn't as big of a deal as I thought it was. Okay. Real quickly, your mini tranquilizers. This is something in the workplace. And part of what we're talking about today is how having knowledge of stress, what your triggers are, as well as what are the things that you can do to get back to that eustress area. Employers will probably ask you, and they're increasingly asking in interviews more and more, how do you manage your stress? And I think if you are able to talk about that to a lot of employers, that shows a lot of maturity, that you've thought through that. You've thought about what you will be like in that workplace. So I think in a way you could say, well, sometimes when I get stressed or I get into that fight or flight response, I tend to have a lot of muscle tension. I tend to withdraw, and I'm a little more irritable than normal. But I know that if I try to initiate that relaxation response, my body can't be in both states. And so I might do some of these things. And these are things that you could do, sit at your desk. You try to sit in a chair. Don't cross your legs. Don't try to constrict blood flow. Try to sit up as straight as you can. And then scan your body for where your discomfort is at. And so right now my discomfort is in my lower back. So I'll try to straighten that up instead of humping over. And a lot of times when I get stressed, I will hold my breath and I'll go like this, which is stressing that part of my back out, right? So I try to do that. Now, you can tense your entire body. You can go like, hold your hands out like this, and you go, hold it, hold it, hold it, and then you exhale and release, release. You can stretch your arms out like this, and then you have your palms down, and then you pull them up like this, okay? And so for people, if you have trouble with tightness in your forearms, you're holding that, and then exhale and the release. And I want you to think about as you're releasing and as you're exhaling, that anxiety is going out with it. That tension is leaving your body. Okay? Now this is a fun one. So you sit in your, and I just want to say this because it's on the internet, right? Okay, so you sit here and you tense what you're sitting on, right? I guess that's your gluteus, right? And so you just hold that really tight. 1, 2 to 5, and then exhale to 5, 3, 4, and release. 5. Or you can take your legs and you can, like this, and you can point your toe toward you. Now, I don't know for you, that's really stretching my calf out right there. And you want to hold it. 1, and on 5, I want you to let it go, and I want you to exhale. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Focus on the feeling you have when the tension in your muscle is gone and what it feels like when you exhale. I actually slow down when I'm talking. When I'm stressed, I have a little spaz. You've already seen it today. You jumping around. These guys see it when I come over. They're like, oh, here comes Dave. Kind of thing. And then after about 10 minutes of feeling like, okay, the guys aren't mad at me because I haven't been around for a long time, I can be a little bit more myself. I've actually had Logan come up to me and go, you need to relax. He came up to me yesterday. I was at Walmart. And I know a lot of our hearts are really heavy right now in this community. We lost somebody. And it really started taking me back to some of the losses that we've had in the past. And my head was down, and I was kind of out of it. And Logan comes up to me at Walmart as I'm looking in the Star Wars aisle, because sometimes my thing, like, for you, might be watching a movie. It's for me, I was like, I'm going to go buy a Star Wars toy. And so, he came up to me and he kind of talked to it. He said, it is pretty tough what happened. And he kind of said something that was really important to me, because, feel the pain, and let's focus on helping others moving forward, or that's the way I felt to me. And so that's where I need somebody to be able to do that. So invite your friends that if they're worried about you, to let you know that. Okay. All right. You take in a slow, comfortable, deep breath. And as you exhale, you might want to associate. Hey, Joel, did you hear us talking about you on the internet? Hey, good job. No, we were talking about how we know triggers of when people are frustrated. And I was kind of saying that I think you get a little more quiet. You might kind of get a little more down. And I do the same thing. And so what we talked about is being able to talk to each other about when we get to that point. Now, really, I created a tremendous amount of stress for you, because when you walked in, I said that, so I apologize. But I was also very congratulatory of how many people you got to come to the session. So this is the Joel. Okay. Breathe comfortably for several moments and think of a pleasant thought. If any of you, when you're stressed, have a place in your head that you've always wanted to go, or that you've associated with relaxation? For me, and I know this sounds awful, but it's about sitting on my room, a nice room in Cancun, where I'm looking over at the ocean, and I've already ordered room service. And my dogs are at home being taken care of, and I don't feel like I have that many responsibilities. So now I associates with just seeing the ocean. And so I'll have a screensaver on my phone of a picture that I've taken when I was in a place where I was really relaxed. And it's interesting how those images can oftentimes influence your attitudes, your brain chemistry, and can change your mood almost instantaneously. So what I want you to get out of all of this is that we can get stressed like that. And a lot of times it's so automatic and involuntary. But we can also use our knowledge of our physiology, our thoughts, our emotions, our cognitions, like I was talking about, and our behaviors. We can use that to our advantage. And we can help bring ourselves back down to a place of being relaxed. So, if in a job interview, someone asks you what you do for stress, give them a mouthful. Teach them a little bit about the fight or flight. And tell them how, in a work environment, you would handle stress. Jenny's a recruiter. Jenny, you've interviewed over 10,000 people. It's 20,000, right? You had me at 10. But at 20,000. What kind of questions do you ask to assess how they handle stress?
Oftentimes we'll use things like case scenarios, so we actually put you in a hypothetical environment to see how you would respond. So we may talk about a project with a deadline, or for instance, what if you're working on something that you've put 6 months work into, and then the CEO walks in and says, I need something completely different by 5 o'clock on Friday. How do you deal with those things? So we actually ask for you to walk through that process and how you deal with that, in your personal life and your professional life is some of the ways we do that. We do also ask for outlets, or what kind of resources do you turn to? Like in a lot of work environments, there's things called employee assistance programs. So that means there's in-house people to help be there for you in those kind of support needs. Do you reach out to people? Do you communicate your needs? If something is stressing you, it's not good to hold it in. It creates more problems. It creates problems within the team, things like that. So going to a manager or a boss and being able to effectively communicate those needs are another piece that we'll oftentimes ask about.
What's the best response you've heard someone give in an interview to how they deal with stress?
Sometimes it's really the people that own it and can kind of be a little funny or interesting about it. Interestingly enough, it was probably one of my coworkers that I recruited for, and we shared actually this after we hired her. So we're both kids of the 90s, and music was very influential for her. So if she was really stressed at work, she would listen to something that would be uplifting for her on the way to work. If there was something really stressed in the work environment, she would put music on that was really unique to her and what made her feel well. So she's like, I will totally rock out to 90s Disney music. And that was probably one of the best responses, because it never would have occurred to me, and that she was so personal about it, and you could see her face light up when she talked about it. What was cool was that we ended up sharing that later on. That became our stressor. So we made a connection, and we knew if we walked into one of the other's offices and there's Disney music on, we may need a few minutes. We may need that support, those kinds of things. So that was a pretty cool response to get.
I really like looking at motivation. There's a theorist out there, and I love his name because I can't pronounce it. And I actually saw him present. And have you ever heard of this idea called flow, the flow state? And the idea is when our skills match our challenges, oftentimes, and a lot of that can be perception, but we can feel like things are so much easier. Oftentimes we lose track of, it's called ego transcendence, time transcendence. Things just, we're just, have you heard athletes talk about being in the zone? Okay. Now, if you're not in a flow state, and let's say your skills far outweigh the challenges, you can be bored. When your skills are beneath your challenges, we're anxious. And what's interesting to me is how do we know that our skills don't match our challenges? That's got to be cognitive in some ways. Am I going incompetent? So I automatically interpret that challenge to be above my level, and I create an anxiety state as a result of how I value my automatic thought towards myself, which creates an anxiety response. So how can we learn to use these techniques to reinforce our skills? Because most of you at Truman, when I work with you in careers, it's like career decision making, I look at 5 variables when I think about career satisfaction, making a choice about a major or a career that is going to be satisfying to you. One of them is values. One's interest, personality, ability, and perceived ability. I can't tell you the number of Truman students that have Chemistry 130, get the worst grade in their life, get a whammy put on them to the point where they perceive their ability to be less than it actually is. How do we help our young people that we are taking into organizations or that we work with all the time to help recorrect that misperception of their ability? Because if we don't do that, they are often going to undervalue and undersell themselves. And because of that, they are going to put themselves in an anxiety response much more than they need to be. So, the other thing I want you to hear from this is we've got to communicate with each other. If we're worried about each other, say something. I'd much rather you deal with the anxiety of someone being mad at me for going, is there something wrong, than not saying anything and seeing you suffer. All right, any questions? I know we went past 6 o'clock, so I apologize. We're going to have to do the post-test here in just a second. What was helpful about what we talked about today? Yep.
I like hearing more about the cognitive restructuring because I think that's really powerful.
Especially for training students. Okay, Jesse.
How like you really like kind of like how stress kind of I think like a hard concept to kind of understand, but when you put it in like very like explicit and biological terms, those are things that usually observe. If you understand them, like they're less overwhelming.
It's interesting for me to hear you get stressed. I just had this idealized vision of you being like the coolest, calmest cucumber ever.
Do you ever find someone like that? Let me know. I don't think they exist. Yeah, I still stress out quite a bit.
And I want to thank you all for sharing. You didn't know me, you didn't know most of these people in this group, and I asked questions that you might not have felt comfortable responding to. Okay. What is something I could do to improve the presentation? Or that you would want to hear more of if I did this again?
Maybe like social norming, especially on Truman. It's so normal to like internalize focus themselves if they're stressed. And so kind of create an environment where it's normal to reach out to people.
Yeah. Yeah. And how as a community can we help work with faculty and talk about those things? Because we've lost a lot of people, and I'm not saying it's because of necessarily academic rigor that we have. But you have to be at a pretty chronically stressed place to the point where you don't see a lot of value in yourself. And so how can we go out there? Maybe that's one of the ways to do it, is talk about 85% of Truman students, I'm making this up, 85% of Truman students report having 2 to 3 episodes of anxiety within a 1-week period to the point it interferes with their ability to sleep. You know, there's actually research out there, the American College Health Association survey.
We also have Truman PIP data, so Partners in Prevention puts out monthly data. If you want to look at it, you can go to Truman PIP.
And I used to work with that group, and you know what that assessment used to be called? The Much BS. It's Missouri College Health Behavioral Survey. So they changed it to that, which. You know.
I mean, it's still monthly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the same, but yeah.
But there is data out there. That
Yeah.
makes it fun. Good. Let's build each other up by being honest with each other. Let's show that we care for each other. Let's know that we all get stressed out. Let's give each other the benefit of the doubt sometimes if people get irritable with us. It's probably not about us. It's probably that they're having a tough day. Maybe figuring out what we can do for them that they might not expect, that might help them feel valued. Sometimes when you're really stressed, if you do something nice for somebody, they're kind of like, holy moly. It kind of knocks them out of that kind of haze that they have. Okay, so do you want to do the post-test?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much.
Alrighty.